The stagecoach lurched through the muddy ruts of Cedar Street as twilight painted the sky in shades of amber and rose. Sarah Jenkins pressed her threadbare shawl tighter around her narrow shoulders, her stomach churning not from the bumpy ride, but from the letter clutched in her trembling hand. Next to her, 16-year-old Lucy dozed fitfully, her auburn hair falling across her freckled cheek. They'd traveled 300 miles with nothing but hope and the promise of a better life waiting in Willowbrook, Texas. Tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah had answered Thomas Mitchell's advertisement in desperation. After their father's death and the bank taking their farm in Missouri, she'd seen the words, "seeking wife of gentle nature and household skills," as their salvation. Now, as the stagecoach finally shuddered to a halt outside the Willowbrook Inn, she wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. The driver, a gruff man with tobacco-stained whiskers, helped them down with barely concealed impatience. Their single trunk landed in the dust with a thud that seemed to echo their uncertain future. Sarah smoothed her best dress, a faded blue calico that had seen better days, and gathered her courage. Lucy rubbed her eyes and stood beside her sister, their shoulders touching in silent support. Willowbrook's main street stretched before them like a dusty ribbon, flanked by wooden buildings that looked weathered but sturdy. The smell of wood smoke and something savory drifted from nearby chimneys, reminding Sarah they hadn't eaten since morning. A few curious faces peered from windows, and somewhere a dog barked incessantly. Mrs. Dorothy Walsh emerged from the inn, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron. Her sharp grey eyes took in the sisters with practiced efficiency. "You'd be the Jenkins girls," she stated rather than asked, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd run a boarding house for 20 years. "Mr. Mitchell sent word you'd be arriving today." Sarah nodded, trying to keep her voice steady. "Yes, ma'am, thank you for the accommodation." Mrs. Walsh's expression softened slightly as she noticed Lucy's pale complexion. "Rooms upstairs, first door on the right, supper's at 6. Mr. Mitchell expects you at his ranch tomorrow at noon, sharp." She paused, studying Sarah more carefully. "You look like you could use a good meal, both of you." Inside, the boarding house smelled of beeswax and boiled potatoes. Their room was small but clean, with 2 narrow beds and a washstand. Sarah unpacked their few belongings while Lucy collapsed on the nearest bed, exhaustion finally overtaking her attempts to appear. "Strong." "Sarah," Lucy whispered, her voice thick with worry. "What if he doesn't like us?" Sarah sat beside her sister, smoothing her hair with gentle fingers. "Then we'll figure something else out. We always do." But even as she spoke the reassuring words, doubt gnawed at her stomach. Their savings were nearly gone, and winter was approaching. This had to work. That evening, they joined the other boarders for supper, a hearty stew and fresh bread that tasted like heaven after their long journey. Sarah noticed the way people glanced at them, some with curiosity, others with something that might have been pity. She kept her back straight and her chin up, though inside she felt as fragile as dried leaves. After the meal, Sarah volunteered to help Mrs. Walsh clear the dishes, hoping to make a good impression. In the kitchen, the older woman studied her with those penetrating grey eyes. "You're thinner than most girls who come out here," Mrs. Walsh observed, not unkindly. "Men like Mitchell, they tend to prefer more substantial women." Sarah's cheeks burned. "I've always been slender, Ma'am, but I'm strong and I can work hard." Mrs. Walsh nodded slowly. "I'm sure you can, dear. Just be prepared. Men like Mitchell, they have certain expectations." That night, Sarah lay awake, listening to Lucy's soft breathing, her mind churning, with possibilities both hopeful and terrifying. Through the thin walls, she could hear other boarders moving about, the creak of floorboards, the murmur of conversations. Somewhere in the distance, a fiddle played a mournful tune that seemed to echo her own uncertain heart. Tomorrow would bring answers, for better or worse. Sarah pressed her hand to her chest, feeling the rapid beat of her heart, and whispered, a prayer into the darkness. They'd come too far to turn back now. Morning arrived too soon, announced by a rooster's insistent crowing and the clatter of pots in the kitchen below. Sarah dressed carefully in her best dress, the same blue calico, newly pressed and with fresh ribbons at the collar. Lucy helped braid her hair, weaving in wildflowers they'd found behind the inn. You look beautiful, Lucy said softly, but Sarah caught the worry in her sister's eyes. At precisely noon, they stood outside the boarding house, waiting for the wagon Mr. Mitchell had promised to send. The sun beat down mercilessly, and Sarah felt perspiration gathering beneath her corset. Her dress, which had seemed appropriate back home, suddenly felt too loose, too faded, too everything. When the wagon finally arrived, driven by a taciturn ranch hand who barely acknowledged them, Sarah's anxiety reached new heights. The ride to Mitchell Ranch took 30 minutes that felt like hours. Lucy remained silent beside her, occasionally squeezing Sarah's hand in encouragement. The ranch house appeared on the horizon like a judgment. It was larger than Sarah had expected, built of stone and timber, with a wide porch that spoke of prosperity. Cattle dotted the surrounding pastures, and several outbuildings suggested a well-established operation. Thomas Mitchell, it seemed, was indeed a man of means. The wagon pulled up to the front porch, where a figure emerged from the shadows. Thomas Mitchell was tall and broad-shouldered, his face weathered by sun and wind. His dark hair was immaculately groomed, and his clothes spoke of quality. But it was his eyes that made Sarah's stomach drop, cold, calculating, and currently fixed on her with undisguised disappointment. He descended the porch steps slowly, each footfall deliberate. When he reached the wagon, he didn't offer to help, and them down. Instead, he stood with his hands on his hips, his gaze traveling from Sarah's face down to her feet and back up again. You, Sarah Jenkins. His voice was deep, but held no warmth. Yes, sir. And this is my sister, Lucy. Mitchell barely glanced at Lucy. You're not what I expected. Sarah's heart pounded, but she kept her voice steady. I hope I can still meet your needs, Mr. Mitchell. I'm a hard worker and... You're too skinny, he interrupted bluntly. I need a wife who can bear strong sons, work the ranch, manage a household. You look like a stiff wind would blow you to Oklahoma. The words hit Sarah like physical blows. Beside her, Lucy stiffened, but Sarah placed a warning hand on her arm. Sir, I may be slender, but I assure you I'm healthy and capable. I've run a household since I was 15, and I'm skilled in... Save it. Mitchell's voice grew colder. I don't need to hear about your skills. What I need is a woman who looks like she can survive out here, not some delicate flower who'll wilt at the first hardship. A few ranch hands had gathered nearby, pretending to work, but clearly listening. Sarah felt their eyes on her, felt the humiliation burning in her cheeks. I understand your concerns, Mr. Mitchell, but perhaps if you gave me a chance to prove... I said save it! Mitchell's voice boomed across the yard, startling the horses. I'm not running a charity for waifs and strays. You can take your skinny self back to wherever you came from. I'll find a real woman, not some scarecrow in a dress. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah felt Lucy trembling beside her, and she knew her sister was fighting tears. The ranch hands looked away, some with embarrassment, others with cruel amusement. With tremendous effort, Sarah kept her voice calm and dignified. Thank you for your time, Mr. Mitchell. We'll trouble you no further. She climbed down from the wagon without assistance, then helped Lucy. They gathered their small bundle of possessions, gifts they'd brought now unwanted, and began the long walk back to town. Behind them, Mitchell called out to his men, next time, make sure the girls know what they're getting into. I don't have time to waste on unsuitable candidates. Laughter followed his words, sharp and cutting in the afternoon air. Sarah walked with her head high, though inside she felt like crumbling. 30 minutes stretched ahead of them. 30 minutes of walking in the heat, with dust sticking to their sweaty faces and Mitchell's words echoing in her ears. Lucy walked close beside her, their arms linked, finding strength in their shared humiliation. Halfway back to town, Lucy finally spoke. "He was wrong, Sarah. You're not too skinny. You're perfect just as you are." Sarah squeezed her sister's arm. "Let's just focus on getting back, sweetheart." But as they trudged along the rutted road, Sarah's mind raced. What would they do now? Their savings wouldn't last long, and winter was coming. She'd staked everything on this opportunity, and it had crumbled to dust in minutes. The sun began to sink lower, casting long shadows across the prairie. With each step toward Willowbrook, Sarah felt their options narrowing. She'd come so far, hoped so much, only to be dismissed like a piece of inferior livestock. Yet even in her despair, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered that perhaps this was for the best. A man who could be so cruel in their first meeting wasn't someone she'd want to spend her life with, but what other choice did she have? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As the outline of Willowbrook finally appeared on the horizon, Sarah straightened her shoulders once more. They would survive this. They had survived losing their father, losing their farm, losing everything they'd ever known. Somehow, they would survive this too. The sound of hammer on anvil reached them before they entered town proper. From somewhere ahead came the rhythmic clanging of metalwork, steady and sure. Sarah had never paid much attention to blacksmiths before, but something about that sound, its constancy, its purpose, comforted her troubled heart. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new uncertainties, but tonight she would let herself rest in the small comfort of the Willowbrook Inn, gather her strength, and begin again. Because that's what Jenkins women did. They endured the boarding. Now seemed different when they returned. Shadows longer and the air cooler. Sarah's legs trembled from the walk, but she refused to let Lucy see how deeply Mitchell's rejection had shaken her. Mrs. Walsh was in the parlor when they entered, mending a shirt by lamplight. She looked up at their disheveled appearance and set her sewing aside without a word. "How did it go at Mitchell's?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. Sarah opened her mouth to respond, but found her throat tight with unshed tears. Lucy stepped forward instead. "He was horrible to Sarah," the younger girl said, her voice quavering with indignation. "He called her a scarecrow and said she was too skinny to be a proper wife." Mrs. Walsh's expression hardened. "That sounds like Thomas Mitchell, all bluster and no substance." She gestured toward the kitchen. "Come along, both of you. I've got fresh bread and jam, and we need to talk about your options." In the kitchen, Mrs. Walsh bustled about, pouring tea and slicing generous portions of bread. The normalcy of her movements helped calm Sarah's racing heart. When they were all seated around the small table, the older woman fixed Sarah with a direct gaze. "First things first, Mitchell's a fool. You're not too skinny, you're refined. Some men can't tell the difference." She sipped her tea deliberately. "Second, you're not the first woman to come through here and face rejection. Won't be the last. Either." Sarah finally found her voice. "I don't know what to do now. We used most of our savings getting here, and I promised Lucy I'd keep us together." "And you will," Mrs. Walsh said firmly. "Willowbrook may be small, but we look after our own. There's work to be found if you're willing to do it." Lucy leaned forward eagerly. "What kind of work?" "Well," Mrs. Walsh began, counting on her fingers. "Mary Sullivan at the bakery always needs help during the morning rush. Dr. Cooper's been looking for someone to assist with his practice, filing papers, keeping instruments clean. And Mrs. Foster at the schoolhouse mentioned needing someone to mend the children's clothes and tend the garden. Sarah felt a flicker of hope kindle in her chest. Would they really consider hiring me? Why wouldn't they? You're clearly educated, well-mannered, and from what I can see, hard-working. Mrs. Walsh reached across the table and patted Sarah's hand. Give it a day or two to settle yourself, then we'll start making inquiries. That evening, Sarah sat by the window in their small room, brushing Lucy's hair and trying to organize her thoughts. The events of the day played over and over in her mind. Mitchell's cruel words, the long walk back to town, Mrs. Walsh's unexpected kindness. Sarah, Lucy's voice was soft in the gathering darkness. Are you sorry we came? Sarah paused. In her brushing, the question struck deeper than she expected. No, she said finally, surprised to find she meant it. I'm not sorry. Mitchell was wrong for us. For me. But maybe there's something else here for us. Lucy twisted around to look at her sister. You really think so? I have to, Sarah admitted, because the alternative is giving up, and we Jenkins women don't do that. The next morning brought Sunday, and with it the clanging of church bells. Sarah dressed carefully in her second-best dress, a dove-grey cotton that complemented her fair complexion without emphasizing her slender frame. She'd spent the night hemming it slightly to account for the weight she'd lost during their journey. Mrs. Walsh had mentioned that attending services would be a good way to meet people properly, and Sarah was determined to make a better impression than yesterday's disaster. She pinned her honey blonde hair into a neat chignon and helped Lucy with her own preparations. The walk to St. Mary's Church took them down Cedar Street, past the blacksmith's forge she'd heard yesterday. This morning, with no work being done, she could see it properly. A sturdy building with wide doors and a covered area for working outdoors. Tools hung in precise order on the walls, and several finished pieces waited to be collected. Someone took pride in their work here. The church was simple but welcoming, with white-painted walls and colorful glass windows that cast rainbow patterns across the wooden pews. Parishioners filed in quietly, many nodding to Sarah and Lucy with polite recognition. Mrs. Walsh had saved them seats near the middle, away from the very front where newcomers might feel too exposed. Reverend Miller's sermon focused on kindness to strangers, and Sarah wondered if he'd heard about yesterday's events. More likely, she reasoned, kindness to newcomers was a frequent theme in a town that regularly received travelers and new residents. After the service, people lingered in the churchyard, catching up on news and making introductions. Sarah found herself surrounded by curious but friendly faces. Mrs. Foster, a plump woman with steel-grey hair, immediately engaged Lucy in conversation about the school. Dr. Cooper, distinguished despite his slightly rumpled coat, asked Sarah about her experiences with home remedies. My mother always said willow bark tea for headaches, Sarah told him, gaining confidence as people actually listened to her opinions. Excellent advice, Dr. Cooper nodded approvingly. Amazing how much folk wisdom aligns with medical science. You must come by the office sometime. I'd be interested in hearing more of your mother's remedies. Mary Sullivan from the bakery was less subtle in her approach. Mrs. Walsh says you might be looking for work, she said, her Irish accent making the words dance. Could use help with the morning baking if you're not afraid of early hours. Before Sarah could respond, someone cleared their throat nearby. She turned to find a tall man standing slightly apart from the group, hat in his hands. His dark hair was neatly combed, and his blue eyes held a warmth she hadn't expected to see again so soon after Mitchell's coldness. Excuse me, miss, he paused politely. Jenkins, Sarah Jenkins, and this is my sister Lucy. William Carter, but most call me Will. His smile included both sisters, but lingered on Sarah. I run the forge down on Cedar Street. Couldn't help overhearing about employment opportunities. Sarah's heart did an unexpected flutter. Unlike Mitchell's calculating assessment, Will's gaze seemed to see her as a person, not just a potential acquisition. "I make most of my own clothes," Will continued, looking slightly embarrassed, "but I'm hopeless with repairs. Button falls off, and I'm likely to sew the whole thing shut. Mrs. Walsh mentioned you're handy with a needle?" "I am," Sarah confirmed, wondering where this was leading. "Well, I've got a pile of shirts that need attention, and my brother Ben's even worse with a needle than I am. If you're willing, I could pay you for mending work. It's not much, but—" "That would be wonderful," Sarah interrupted, then blushed at her eagerness. "I mean, I'd be happy to help." Will's smile widened. "Excellent. I can bring them by the boarding house whenever it's convenient for you." As if summoned by hearing his name, a younger version of Will approached the group. Ben Carter shared his brother's dark hair and blue eyes, but his features were softer, less defined. His face lit up when he saw Lucy. "You're new in town?" he said to her with the direct manner of youth. "Just arrived yesterday," Lucy replied, color rising in her cheeks. "Ben," Will said warningly, but his eyes held amusement. "Don't overwhelm Miss Lucy with questions." "I wasn't going to," Ben protested. "I was just going to ask if she'd like to see the new puppies at Miller's farm this afternoon." Lucy glanced at Sarah, who nodded slightly. "I'd like that very much." As the conversation continued, Sarah found herself relaxing for the first time. Since arriving in Willowbrook, these people weren't judging her appearance or weighing her market value. They were simply being kind. Mrs. Foster drew her into a discussion about organizing charity baskets for families struggling with the upcoming winter. Dr. Cooper asked her opinion on organizing his medical supplies. Mary Sullivan pressed a warm cinnamon roll into her hand, insisting she was too thin and needed feeding up, but saying it in a way that was nurturing rather than critical. And Will kept finding excuses to continue their conversation, asking about her journey west, her previous home, her opinion on everything from the unusually warm autumn to the best methods for preserving food for winter. "Have you explored much of the town yet?" he asked eventually. "No, just the boarding house and church so far." "Well, that won't do." Will glanced at the sky, gauging the time. "If you're free this afternoon, I could show you around. Important things like where to find the best coffee and which shopkeepers will extend credit if needed." Sarah hesitated, mindful of propriety. But Mrs. Walsh, who had been listening, spoke up. "That's a fine idea, Will. The girls should know their way around if they're staying." "If we're staying?" Sarah repeated. "Of course you're staying," Mrs. Walsh said, as if it were obvious. "Where else would you go? You've got work offers already, a comfortable room, and Sunday services. What more could you need?" Looking around at the friendly faces, at Lucy chatting animatedly with Ben, at Will's patient smile, Sarah felt something loosen in her chest. Maybe Mrs. Walsh was right. Maybe there was more here for them than just a failed arrangement with a cruel man. That afternoon, Will proved to be an excellent guide. He showed them Turner's General Store, where Mr. Bob Turner greeted them warmly and promised fair prices. He pointed out old Pete Johnson's livery stable, explaining that Pete would always help in emergencies, even if payment was delayed. "And here," Will said, stopping outside his forge, "is where I spend most of my time." The afternoon sun slanted through the open doors, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Tools seemed to have their own ordered system, and several projects, in various stages of completion, lined the walls. "It's larger than it looks from outside," Sarah observed. "Has to be. People need everything from nails to wagon wheels to decorative pieces for the church." Will pointed to an intricate iron cross, leaning against the wall. "That's for the new chapel they're building." "It's beautiful," Lucy breathed, running her fingers over the detailed metalwork. "Will's got a gift," Ben added, pride evident in his voice. "Folks come from 3 towns over for his work." Will looked uncomfortable with the praise. "I just like making things that last," he said simply. "Speaking of which, I should get those shirts for you, Miss Sarah, if you're sure you don't mind." "I don't mind at all. It will give me something useful to do while Lucy's looking at puppies." Will disappeared into a back room and returned with a bundle wrapped in brown paper. "There's no rush," he said, handing it to her. "Whenever you have time." "I'll start this evening," Sarah promised. "Thank you for the work. Thank you for accepting it." Will's eyes held hers for a moment longer than strictly necessary. "And thank you for letting me show you around." As they walked back toward the boarding house, Lucy chatted about the puppies and Ben's promise to teach her to ride. Sarah only half listened, her mind replaying the day's events. Less than 24 hours ago, she'd been devastated by rejection. Now she had 3 job offers, new acquaintances who seemed genuinely friendly, and the beginning of something that might eventually become home. That evening, after Lucy had gone to sleep, Sarah unwrapped Will's shirts. There were 6, all of good quality cotton but showing wear. Some needed buttons, others had small tears, and one had a stain that would require careful treatment. As she worked, her needle moving in practiced rhythm, she thought about the difference between Thomas, Mitchell and William Carter. Mitchell had looked at her and seen only what was lacking. Will had looked at her and seen a person who might be helpful, might have skills to offer, might even be interesting to know better. The first shirt was blue and white checked, soft from many washings. As she sewed on a new button, she imagined Will wearing it, perhaps standing at his anvil, sweat dampening the fabric as he worked. The thought made her blush, and she scolded herself for such frivolous imaginings. By the time the church bells rang 9 o'clock, she had repaired 3 shirts. The work was soothing, familiar, and reminded her of evenings at home when she and Lucy would sit by the fire, mending and talking. But those evenings were gone forever, lost with their father and their farm. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Lucy stirred, but didn't wake as Sarah tiptoed to the door. Mrs. Walsh stood in the hallway holding a steaming mug. "Thought you might like some tea," she said, "and I wanted to apologize for earlier." "Apologize?" Sarah took the mug gratefully. "For not warning you more directly about Mitchell." Mrs. Walsh sighed. "I knew he'd likely reject you. He's done it before. Sent 3 women packing in the last 2 years. Always finds something wrong." Sarah blew on her tea to cool it. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because sometimes we need to face our worst fears to discover our own strength." Mrs. Walsh smiled slightly. "And because I had a feeling Willowbrook itself might have better plans for you." "Better plans?" "You're not the first mail-order bride to end up staying in town despite initial rejections. Won't be the last. Sometimes what we think we want isn't what we actually need." Sarah considered this, thinking of Will's kind eyes and gentle manner, so different from what she'd imagined her future husband would be like. "Do you really think we can make a life here?" "I think you already are, dear. 3 job offers in 1 day? That's not chance. That's the town recognizing worth when it sees it." Mrs. Walsh patted her shoulder. "Get some rest. Tomorrow brings new beginnings." After the older woman left, Sarah returned to her mending with renewed purpose. Tomorrow she would go to the bakery early, help Mary Sullivan with the morning rush. She would stop by Dr. Cooper's office to discuss organizing his supplies. She would explore Mrs. Foster's idea about charity baskets. And she would return Will's mended shirts, perhaps stay for a few minutes to chat, to learn more about the man who had shown such unexpected kindness. The candlelight flickered as she worked, casting shifting shadows on the walls. Outside, Willowbrook settled into night, its streets empty, but its houses warm with lamplight. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, and another answered. The sounds of a community, of people living and working and hoping together. Sarah finished the 4th shirt and set it carefully with the others. Her fingers were slightly sore, but it was a good ache, the ache of productive work. For the first time since her father's death, she felt like she was moving forward rather than just surviving. Tomorrow would bring challenges, certainly. The future remained uncertain, but tonight, surrounded by honest work and the knowledge that people in this town had already begun to accept them, Sarah allowed herself to hope. As she prepared for bed, Lucy mumbled sleepily, "Sarah, did something good happen today?" Sarah smiled in the darkness, thinking of church bells and warm bread, of job offers and friendly faces, of Will's quiet kindness and Ben's boyish enthusiasm. "Yes, sweetheart," she whispered. "I think it did." The last thing she heard before sleep claimed her was the distant sound of something metallic, perhaps the night wind moving tools in the forge. A gentle reminder that tomorrow would bring new beginnings and the chance to prove that sometimes rejection opens doors to better opportunities than we ever could have imagined. Monday morning arrived with a crisp breeze that carried the scent of wood smoke and baking bread through Willowbrook streets. Sarah woke before dawn, as had been her habit since childhood, and found herself energized despite the emotional exhaustion of the previous days. She dressed quickly in her work dress, a sturdy brown cotton that would hide flour dust, and tiptoed downstairs to find Mrs. Walsh already in the kitchen. "Early riser, I see," the older woman approved, pouring Sarah a cup of coffee. "Mary, Sullivan opens the bakery at 4, but customers don't usually arrive until 5:30. Perfect time for you to learn the routine." Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully, savoring its warmth. "I've never worked in a bakery before, but I'm eager to learn." Mary's patient and the work isn't complicated. Mostly serving customers, keeping the shop tidy, and occasionally helping with decorating special orders. Mrs. Walsh handed her a small burlap sack. "Here, leftover biscuits from supper. You'll work up an appetite." The walk to Sullivan's bakery took Sarah past Will's forge, where lamplight already glowed from the windows. She could hear the faint sound of metal on metal. The man started work early too. The thought made her smile as she quickened her pace toward the bakery's warm, golden windows. Mary Sullivan proved to be as energetic as her red hair suggested. She moved through the small kitchen like a dancer, her movements precise and efficient. Despite the chaos of mixing bowls, rising dough, and 2 ovens running simultaneously. "Oh, there you are," she called, barely glancing up from kneading a massive ball of dough. "Grab an apron from the hook. We've got bread to finish and 3 dozen cinnamon rolls to glaze before opening." The work was physical, but satisfying. Sarah learned to judge when bread was perfectly baked by its color and sound when tapped. She discovered the rhythm of customer service, greeting familiar faces, remembering orders, making change quickly and accurately. By mid-morning, her hands bore flour fingerprints and her face glowed from the oven's heat, but she felt more accomplished than she had in months. "You're a natural," Mary declared during a brief lull. "Most new girls break at least 2 plates. By lunch, you've managed to keep everything intact." Sarah beamed at the praise, carefully wiping down the counter. "I'd like the work. It feels honest." "That it is. Feed folks, see them smile, get paid fairly. Not much better than that." Mary studied her thoughtfully. "Mind if I ask why you really came to Willowbrook?" Sarah hesitated, then decided on truthful simplicity. "To marry Thomas Mitchell, but he decided I wasn't suitable." Mary snorted. "Mitchell's an ass. Always has been. You're well rid of him." She untied her apron strings. "Tell you what, why don't you handle the shop for a bit? I need to check on the sourdough starter in back, and customers have been light. Good practice for you." Left alone at the counter, Sarah felt a flutter of nervous excitement. Within minutes, the bell above the door chimed, and she looked up to see Will Carter entering the shop. "Oh," he said, seeming genuinely surprised. "You're working here?" "Starting today," Sarah replied, pleased to see a familiar face. "What can I get for you?" "The usual Monday order. 2 loaves of wheat bread and whatever Mary's got fresh for breakfast. He paused, studying her face. How are you settling in? Very well, thank you. Everyone's been incredibly kind. She moved to gather his order, aware of his gaze following her movements. I finished repairing your shirts last night. They're at the boarding house whenever you'd like them. No rush, though I do appreciate the quick work. Will accepted the packages, their fingers brushing briefly as she handed them over. Actually, I was wondering, there's a barn raising this Saturday at the Murphy farm. Most of the town attends. Would you and Lucy like to come? Sarah's heart skipped. A barn raising. It's a community event. Everyone brings food, helps with construction, and in the evening there's usually music and dancing. Will cleared his throat, looking suddenly boyish. Thought it might be a good way for you both to meet more people. Before Sarah could respond, the bell chimed again, and Sheriff Mason entered, bringing with him the authority of his badge and a weathered kindness in his eyes. Morning, Will, and you must be Sarah Jenkins, he said, tipping his hat. I'm James Mason, the sheriff around these parts. Sheriff, Sarah acknowledged, feeling slightly overwhelmed by the morning succession of introductions. Heard about your troubles with Mitchell, Sheriff Mason continued matter-of-factly. Want you to know, that's not how we do things in Willowbrook. Man sends for a bride, he treats her with respect, or he answers to me. Will nodded approvingly. Sheriff Mason keeps everyone honest. Well, Sheriff Mason said, ordering a coffee and apple turnover, just wanted you to know you've got law on your side if anyone gives you grief. This town takes care of its own, and far as I'm concerned, you're one of ours now. The simple declaration brought tears to Sarah's eyes, which she quickly blinked away. Thank you, Sheriff. That means more than you know. After the men left, Sarah reflected on how quickly her circumstances had changed. Less than 2 days ago, she'd been humiliated and hopeless. Now she had work, a safe place to stay, and people who seemed genuinely interested in her welfare. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of customers. Sarah met Mrs. Henderson, who ordered special bread for her sick husband. Tommy Baker, a freckled boy who saved weekly for a chocolate eclair, and the Reverend Miller, who complimented her polite manner and asked Lucy about her interest in helping with the church's charity drive. By noon, she was exhausted but satisfied. Mary insisted she take home a loaf of fresh bread and a selection of pastries. For you and Lucy, she explained, and don't try to pay, consider it part of your wages. Returning to the boarding house, Sarah found Lucy helping Mrs. Walsh with laundry. Her sister's face lit up at the sight of the pastries. I've never had cinnamon rolls this good, Lucy declared after her first bite. How was your morning? Busy and wonderful. Mary says I can work 3 mornings a week. Sarah settled into a chair, suddenly aware of how her feet ached. Will Carter invited us to a barn raising on Saturday. Lucy's eyes widened. Really? Ben mentioned something about that too. He said there's music and dancing, which means we'll need to let out one of your dresses, Mrs. Walsh interjected practically. Can't have you girls looking like you don't care about appearances. That afternoon, while Lucy visited Dr. Cooper's office to learn filing systems, Sarah tackled alterations. She spread Lucy's best dress, a soft lavender cotton, across their bed and began the careful work of letting out seams. As she worked, she reflected on Sheriff Mason's words and Will's invitation. Was she reading too much into Will's kindness, or was something beginning to develop between them? Her contemplation was interrupted by commotion in the street below. Voices raised, in anger, followed by what sounded like someone being roughly handled. Sarah hurried to the window and saw Thomas Mitchell gripping a young woman's arm outside the saloon. The woman appeared to be trying to leave, while Mitchell was insisting she stay. Without thinking, Sarah grabbed her shawl and rushed downstairs. She reached the sidewalk just as Sheriff Mason rounded the corner, clearly responding to complaints. "Everything all right here?" the sheriff asked, his voice carrying quiet authority. "Just having a conversation with my friend," Mitchell slurred, tightening his grip on the woman's arm. "Doesn't look like she's enjoying the conversation," Sarah interjected, surprising herself with her boldness. Mitchell turned, his face darkening when he recognized her. Well, well, the skinny bride decided to stick around after all. "Let go of her arm, Mitchell," Sheriff Mason ordered. "She's obviously trying to leave." "She owes me money," Mitchell claimed, though his grip loosened slightly. The woman, Sarah recognized her as one of the girls who worked at the saloon, looked up gratefully. "I paid him back yesterday, Sheriff. He's just drunk and angry." Sarah stepped forward. "Why don't you come with me? I'll walk you home." Mitchell's eyes flashed dangerously. "You think you're so high and mighty now? Found yourself some work and suddenly you're everyone's savior?" "I think someone should walk her home safely," Sarah replied calmly, offering her arm to the other woman. "Just like someone should have taught you basic decency." The saloon girl took Sarah's arm and they began walking away. Behind them, Sheriff Mason's voice carried clearly. "Mitchell, you're going to walk home, sleep it off, and think about how you're representing this town. Next time I hear about you bothering women, you'll spend the night in jail." The woman Sarah was escorting, who introduced herself as Clara, lived in a small house behind the mercantile. "Thank you," Clara said softly as they reached her door. "Most folks wouldn't get involved." "Someone should," Sarah replied. "Are you all right?" "I am now." Clara hesitated. "You're new in town, aren't you? Came for Mitchell." "I did, but that arrangement ended quickly." Clara laughed, a bitter sound. "Lucky you. Mitchell's been sweet on me for months, but I won't have, him. He doesn't take rejection well. Few men do, in my experience." "True enough." Clara studied her. "You're working at Sullivan's now?" "Starting today, and helping Dr. Cooper organize his office, and possibly assisting Mrs. Foster at the school." "Busy girl." Clara smiled genuinely this time. "Well, if you ever need anything, you know where to find me. Women have to look out for each other in places like this." Walking back to the boarding house, Sarah felt the day's events settling into her bones. She'd stood up to Mitchell again, this time on behalf of another person. The confrontation hadn't frightened her as she'd expected. Instead, she felt stronger, more certain of her place in Willowbrook. Mrs. Walsh was waiting in the parlor when she returned. Heard about the excitement. News travels fast. Always does in small towns. Mrs. Walsh set down her knitting. "You handled yourself well. Takes courage to stand up to men like Mitchell. Someone had to help Clara." "Yes, and you did. People notice that kind of character." She paused meaningfully. "Will Carter stop by while you were out? Brought his mended shirts and something extra." On the table beside Mrs. Walsh lay a small package wrapped in brown paper with Sarah's name written in careful script. "What is it? Why don't you open it?" With curiosity overcoming propriety, Sarah unwrapped the package. Inside was a small journal bound in soft leather with a note tucked beneath the cover. "For recording recipes and remedies. Every healer needs a proper book. Thank you for the exemplary mending, W.C." Sarah ran her fingers over the smooth leather, feeling something warm expand in her chest. No one had given her such a thoughtful gift in years. "That's a man who pays attention," Mrs. Walsh observed with a knowing smile. "He's just being kind." "Kindness comes in many forms." Didn't see him giving journals to any other seamstresses. Sarah blushed but couldn't suppress her smile. "I should thank him. Tomorrow's soon enough. For now, finish Lucy's dress alterations. Your sister's finally found a place where she can be young again. That matters more than you know." That evening, as Sarah worked on the dress alterations, she thought about the day's unexpected turns. From early morning bread baking to standing up to Mitchell, from Sheriff Mason's protection to Will's thoughtful gift. Each moment had added another thread to the fabric of their new life. Lucy returned from Dr. Cooper's office full of stories about medical supplies and patient files, her enthusiasm bringing back some of the childhood vivacity that had been buried under adult responsibilities. Dr. Cooper says, "I have excellent organizational skills," Lucy announced proudly. "He wants me to come 3 afternoons a week. That's wonderful, sweetheart. And Ben stopped by to show me how to feed the horses at the livery. Old Pete says I have a gentle way with animals." Sarah smiled, noting how easily Lucy was claiming space in this town. "You're blooming here." "We both are," Lucy corrected. "Even if Mitchell was horrible, maybe it was meant to happen this way." As they prepared for bed, Sarah opened Will's journal. The pages were creamy white, waiting for her words. On the first page, she wrote the date and a simple entry. "Arrived. In Willowbrook seeking one future, found something unexpected. Mrs. Walsh says we're building a life here, one day at a time. Today I stood up to a bully, learned to serve pastries and received my first gift in this new place. Tomorrow I'll thank the giver and continue forward. The path wasn't what I planned, but perhaps it's leading somewhere better." She closed the journal and extinguished the candle, listening to Lucy's soft breathing and the distant sounds of Willowbrook settling into night. Somewhere out there, Will was probably banking the fires in his forge. Sheriff Mason was making his evening rounds, and Thomas Mitchell was nursing whatever demons drove his cruelty. But here, in this small room above Mrs. Walsh's boarding house, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in months: peace. Not the kind that came from certainty, but the kind that grows from knowing you're exactly where you're supposed to be, even if you never planned to arrive there. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. More work at the bakery, organizing Dr. Cooper's office, thanking Will for his gift. But tonight, she allowed herself to rest in the knowledge that she'd survived her first real tests in Willowbrook and emerged stronger. As sleep finally claimed her, Sarah's last conscious thought was of Will's steady blue eyes and the way he'd looked at her in the bakery, not assessing her worth by some external standard, but simply seeing her as she was. It was a look she wanted to earn again, and many times more. The church bells tolled 11 o'clock, marking the end of one day and the beginning of another. In the darkness, Sarah smiled, feeling the journal's smooth leather beneath her palm, and the promise of empty pages waiting to be filled with the story of their new life in Willowbrook. The morning fog hung low over Cedar Street as Sarah walked to the bakery, carrying Will's mended shirts and the leather journal tucked safely in her shawl. The air held a dampness that promised rain before nightfall, and she quickened her pace to avoid being caught in a downpour during her shift. Mary Sullivan was already pulling fresh loaves from the ovens when Sarah arrived, filling the small space with warmth and the comforting scent of yeast and honey. "Morning's going to be busy," Mary called out cheerfully. "Mrs. Henderson ordered 6 apple pies for the ladies' auxiliary meeting, and the Murphy boys want extra rations for their work crew." Sarah hung her shawl and tied on her apron immediately, falling into the rhythm they'd established over the past few days. As she arranged fresh pastries in the display case, she noticed the steady rain beginning to tap against the windows. The gentle percussion created an oddly soothing backdrop to their morning preparations. The first customer arrived just as the clock struck 5:30, old Pete Johnson, seeking his usual coffee and yesterday's bread at half price. He dripped rain onto the wooden floor and complained about his joints predicting storms, but his eyes held a warmth that belied his gruff manner. "Settling in well, Miss Jenkins?" he asked, counting out coins with gnarled fingers. "Very well, thank you. Everyone's been most welcoming." "Good, good. Town needs more folks like you and your sister, willing to work hard, treat people decent." He paused, studying her face. "Heard about that business with Mitchell yesterday. Standing up for Clara took spine." Word of her encounter with Mitchell had indeed traveled fast. Anyone would have done the same. "No," Pete said firmly. "Anyone wouldn't have." Most folks mind their own business when it comes to Mitchell. You did right. After Pete left, the morning rush intensified. Sarah served 3 farmhands heading to Murphy's place, Mrs. Foster picking up bread for the school children's lunches, and a steady stream of townspeople ducking in from the rain. Between customers, she helped Mary slice pies and arrange special orders. Around 8 o'clock, during a brief lull, she noticed Will Carter outside, studying something in his hands, while rain dripped from his hat brim. He seemed to be gathering courage for something. When he finally entered, shaking droplets from his coat, he looked directly at Sarah with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Morning," he said, settling his hat on a nearby peg. "Brought these back?" He held up the bundle of mended shirts. "They look better than when I bought them new. I'm glad they're satisfactory, and thank you," she gestured toward her pocket where the journal rested, "for the thoughtful gift. It's beautiful." A faint flush crept up Will's neck. "Seemed practical. Figured you might want to record things. Remedies, recipes, thoughts." Mary emerged from the kitchen, wiping floury hands on her apron. "Will Carter, don't tell me you're just here for bread again. You've been in here more this week than the last month combined." Will's flush deepened. "Just collecting my shirts and ordering the usual." Sarah busied herself wrapping his bread, trying to hide her own smile at Mary's teasing. As she handed him the package, their fingers brushed, the second time in as many days, and she noticed the fresh calluses on his palms from recent forge work. "The barn raising on Saturday," Will said, his voice dropping slightly. "Were you able to consider it?" "Yes, Lucy and I would very much like to attend. What time should we—" The door burst open, interrupting them. Thomas Mitchell stumbled in, his clothes rumpled, and his breath already heavy with drink despite the early hour. Sarah's stomach tightened, but she maintained her composure behind the counter. "Well, well," Mitchell said, his voice carrying an edge of mockery. "The whole town's favorite charity case is hard at work." Will stepped sideways, subtly positioning himself between Mitchell and the counter. "Morning, Mitchell. Best you order quickly. Looks like the storm's getting worse." Mitchell ignored him, focusing his bleary gaze on Sarah. "Thought you'd be long gone by now. Must be desperate to stay in a dump like this." "That's enough," Will said quietly, but his voice held steel. "Order something or leave." "I'll order when I'm ready," Mitchell snapped, lurching closer to the counter. "First, I want to know why the skinny bride thinks she can interfere in my business." Sarah straightened, meeting his gaze directly. "I wasn't interfering in your business, Mr. Mitchell. I was helping someone who needed assistance." "Clara doesn't need your help. None of the girls do." Mitchell's voice rose. "You've been here less than a week, and you're already acting like you own the place." Mary Sullivan stepped out from behind the counter, wielding a rolling pin like a weapon. "Thomas Mitchell, you've got 3 seconds to order something or get out of my shop. I won't have you harassing my employees." Mitchell's eyes narrowed. "Your employee? So that's what she is now, the whole town's little pet project." The tension in the room was palpable. Several early customers had paused their conversations to watch the confrontation, and Sarah could feel their collective disapproval directed at Mitchell. $2 for a loaf of bread ought to cover the damages for disrupting business," Will suggested calmly, though his hands had closed into fists at his sides. Mitchell's face reddened with anger. He reached into his pocket, but instead of coins, he pulled out a crumpled letter, one that looked disturbingly familiar to Sarah. "Know what this is?" Mitchell held up the letter. "My advertisement, the one that brought you here." He turned to address the gathering customers. "Want to know what it really said? Seeking wife of gentle nature and household skills." Didn't say anything about taking in skinny waifs who think they're better than everyone else. Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, but before she could respond, the bakery door opened again. Dr. Cooper entered, shaking rain from his umbrella, followed closely by Lucy and Sheriff Mason. "What's the commotion?" Dr. Cooper asked, immediately assessing the tense atmosphere. "Mitchell's causing trouble again," Mary explained tersely. Sheriff Mason's expression hardened as he took in the scene. "That's becoming a habit, Mitchell. Yesterday it was Clara, today it's Sarah, starting to see a pattern." Lucy moved to stand beside her sister, her young face set with determination. "Sarah's done nothing but help people since we arrived. If anyone's causing problems, it's not her." Mitchell laughed, a harsh sound that grated against the morning's peace. "Listen to them all, defending the charity cases. Pathetic." "That's enough," Sheriff Mason said firmly, stepping forward. "Mitchell, you're going to leave now, and you're going to apologize first." "I'll do no such thing. These women, Dr. Cooper interrupted, "are valued members of our community. Sarah's been helping organize my office, Lucy's, showing remarkable aptitude for medical work, and from what Mary tells me, they're both excellent workers." Will moved closer to Sarah, his presence solid and reassuring. "Furthermore," he added, "Sarah's skill with a needle is the best I've seen. She's repaired more items in 3 days than most manage in a month." The customers in the bakery murmured agreement. Mrs. Henderson spoke up. "She helped me carry home groceries yesterday when my back was acting up." Tommy Baker chimed in, "And she always remembers what pastry I like best." Sarah watched, amazed, as people she'd only just met defended her against Mitchell's vitriol. The support was overwhelming, unexpected, and deeply touching. Mitchell, outnumbered and outmaneuvered, clutched his letter with white knuckles. "This is ridiculous. You're all fools, taken in by a pretty face and sob story." "What's ridiculous," Sheriff Mason said coldly, "is a grown man harassing women because he can't handle rejection. Now apologize and leave, or I'll arrest you for disturbing the peace." For a long moment, Mitchell glared around the room. Sarah could see the calculations behind his eyes, weighing his pride against the very real threat of jail. Finally, he mumbled something that might have been an apology and stumbled toward the door. As he reached for the handle, he turned back one last time. "Mark my words, these two will bring nothing but trouble to this town." The door slammed behind him, leaving the bakery in heavy silence. Gradually, conversations resumed, though everyone seemed to be stealing glances at Sarah and Lucy. Dr. Cooper approached the counter, his expression kind but concerned. "Are you all right, my dear?" Sarah nodded, though her hands were trembling slightly. "Yes, thank you. I'm sorry for the disruption." "Nonsense," Mary declared. "Mitchell's the only one who needs to apologize. Now, who wants fresh coffee while, we wait for this storm to pass?" As normalcy returned to the bakery, Will remained close to Sarah's side. "He's wrong, you know," he said quietly. "About everything." Sarah managed a small smile. "Thank you, and thank you for stepping in. That's what neighbors do, what friends do." He hesitated, then added, "What family does." The word family hung in the air between them, carrying weight and promise. Sarah felt something shift inside her, a recognition that maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to understand what Will saw when he looked at her. Not a burden, not a rejected mail-order bride, but a person worth defending, worth knowing, worth caring about. Lucy joined them, sliding her arm around Sarah's waist. "That was scary," she admitted, "but everyone stood up for us." "Yes, they did," Sarah agreed, looking around the bakery with new eyes. These weren't just customers anymore, they were neighbors, acquaintances becoming friends, pieces of a community that was slowly opening to include them. The storm intensified outside, rain lashing against the windows and thunder rumbling overhead. Mary insisted on keeping the bakery open, transforming it into an impromptu shelter for those caught in the weather. Tables were rearranged. Extra. Coffee was brewed. and soon the small space filled with the sound of conversation and laughter. Sarah found herself moving through this transformed space with increasing confidence. She helped serve soup Mary had prepared for lunch, refilled coffee cups, and even led the cleanup of a spill when young Tommy knocked over his cup. With each small task, she felt more integrated into the fabric of Willowbrook life. Around noon, during another lull, Will approached her again. "About Saturday," he said. "The weather should be clear by then. I was thinking, if you'd like, I could walk you and Lucy to the Murphy farm. It's about a mile outside town." Sarah considered this, aware that accepting such an offer would mark a step towards something more than polite acquaintance. "That's very kind. We'd appreciate the company." Will's smile was genuine and warm. "Good. I'll bring Ben along too. He's been talking about Lucy all week." Lucy, who had been arranging napkins nearby, looked up with bright eyes. "Ben's been talking about me," Will chuckled. "Nothing but, though he'd probably die of embarrassment if he knew I told you." As the afternoon wore on and the storm finally began to subside, Sarah reflected on how quickly her circumstances continued to evolve. The morning had brought another confrontation with Mitchell, but also an overwhelming show of community support. She'd witnessed people she barely knew defend her character and recognize her contributions to the town. More significantly, she'd felt the subtle but unmistakable deepening of her connection with Will. His protective stance during the confrontation, his thoughtful gift of the journal, his invitation to accompany them to the barn raising, each gesture built upon the previous ones, creating a foundation for something that might grow into more than friendship. When her shift finally ended, Sarah walked home through puddles left by the storm, the air fresh and clean. She carried Will's payment for the mending work and a sense of accomplishment that extended beyond the day's earnings. She'd faced down Mitchell's antagonism with dignity, proven her worth to skeptical townspeople, and accepted an invitation that felt like choosing a path rather than simply surviving circumstances. Mrs. Walsh was darning socks in the parlor when Sarah arrived. "Heard you had quite a morning," she said without looking up. "News really does travel fast in this town, especially when it involves Mitchell making a fool of himself in public." Mrs. Walsh set down her mending. "How are you feeling about it all?" Sarah sank into a chair, suddenly aware of how exhausted she was. Overwhelmed. Grateful. A little scared, if I'm honest. Normal feelings for someone building a new life. Mrs. Walsh studied her carefully. "And Will Carter?" Heat crept into Sarah's cheeks. "What about him? Don't play coy, dear. The man's been finding excuses to visit that bakery more often than he visits his own brother. And this invitation to the barn raising." Sarah couldn't suppress her smile. "He's been very kind." Kind is one word for it. Interested is another. Mrs. Walsh leaned forward conspiratorially. "Will's a good man, steady, hardworking, respected in the community, not like some I could mention." "Mrs. Walsh, I'm just saying, sometimes the path we don't plan leads us exactly where we need to be. Your arrangement with Mitchell was a disaster from the start, but maybe that disaster opened a door to something better." That evening, as Sarah helped Lucy prepare for bed, her sister voiced similar thoughts. "Do you think everything happens for a reason?" Lucy asked, brushing out her hair. Sarah considered the question carefully. "I think we make reasons out of what happens to us. Mitchell's rejection could have been the end of our story. Instead, we turned it into a beginning." "And Will? What about Will?" Lucy gave her an exasperated look. "Sarah, I'm 16, not 6. I can see how you look at each other." Sarah felt her cheeks warm again. "It's too soon to know what that means." "Maybe, but some things you just feel, don't you?" Before Sarah could respond, a gentle knock sounded at their door. Mrs. Walsh called through the wood. "Sarah?" "You have a visitor." Puzzled, Sarah wrapped her shawl around her nightgown and opened the door. Mrs. Walsh stood in the hallway, holding a small package wrapped in oilcloth. "Will dropped this off. Said he forgot to give it to you earlier, but thought you might need it for tomorrow." Sarah unwrapped the package to find a small tin of salve and a note. "For sore hands after a day of baking. Made with comfrey and beeswax. See you Saturday, W.C." The thoughtfulness of the gift struck her deeply. Will had noticed her hands growing rough from the bakery work and taken the time to craft a remedy. No one had paid such attention to her. Comfort in years. "That's a man who notices details," Mrs. Walsh observed. Later, as Sarah applied the salve to her hands, she thought about the day's events. Mitchell's harassment had been unpleasant, but it had also served to clarify something important. Willowbrook wasn't just tolerating her presence. The town was actively welcoming her and Lucy. People had stood up for them, defended their character, and offered genuine friendship. And Will was offering something more, something that felt both exciting and terrifying, full of potential but requiring trust she wasn't sure she was ready to give. She opened the leather journal he'd given her and began writing about the day. As her pen moved across the page, recording confrontations and kindnesses, storms and salve, she realized she was no longer just surviving. She was documenting a life that was becoming her own. Outside, Willowbrook settled into its nightly rhythm. Somewhere, Will was probably finishing his own evening routine, maybe banking the forge fires and thinking about Saturday's barn raising. Thomas Mitchell was likely nursing his grievances in the saloon. Sheriff Mason was making his rounds, ensuring the town's safety. Dr. Cooper was filing the day's patient notes, and Mary Sullivan was preparing tomorrow's bread dough. All of these lives intersecting, creating the complex tapestry of community that Sarah and Lucy were becoming part of. It was messy sometimes, challenging often, but also warm and real in ways their previous life had never been. Sarah closed the journal and extinguished her candle, listening to Lucy's soft breathing and the distant sound of rain returning. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities and challenges, but tonight, with the scent of Will's salve on her hands and the memory of community support still warm in her heart, she felt ready to face whatever came next. As sleep claimed her, Sarah's last thought was of Saturday's barn raising, a chance to see Will outside the constraints of business transactions, to watch Lucy dance with Ben, to participate in the kind of community celebration she'd only heard about in stories. Mitchell had rejected her for being too skinny, but Willowbrook was embracing her for being exactly who she was. The morning would come too soon, bringing more work at the bakery, another afternoon organizing Dr. Cooper's office, and the ongoing project of building a life in this unexpected place. But for now, she rested in the knowledge that she was no longer alone in facing these challenges. She had Lucy, Mrs. Walsh, friendly customers, and maybe, just maybe, something special developing with a patient blacksmith who noticed when her hands needed healing. Saturday morning arrived with clear skies and a crispness that promised perfect weather for the barn raising. Sarah woke before dawn, her stomach fluttering with nervous anticipation. She'd spent the previous evening pressing her blue calico dress and helping Lucy with the final alterations on her lavender cotton. Now, in the pale pre-dawn light, she carefully arranged her hair in a crown of braids, allowing soft tendrils to frame her face in a style Lucy had assured her was both practical and becoming. Lucy bustled about their small room, equally excited about the day ahead. "Do you think Ben will ask me to dance?" she wondered aloud, smoothing her dress for the 100th time. "I'm certain he will," Sarah replied, smiling at her sister's enthusiasm. It had been so long since Lucy had something to look forward to, and seeing her excitement was worth all the upheaval of their recent journey. Mrs. Walsh had prepared a hearty breakfast for them, along with a basket of her famous preserves to Contribute to the community feast. Remember, she instructed as they prepared to leave, a barn raising is where friendships are solidified and romances bloom. Make the most of it. They walked together to the edge of town, where Will had arranged to meet them, the morning air crisp and filled with the scent of autumn leaves. Birds sang enthusiastically in the trees lining Cedar Street, and the town was beginning to stir with the promise of the day's festivities. Will and Ben waited beside a borrowed wagon, both dressed in their Sunday best, despite the day's physical labor ahead. Will wore a crisp white shirt and dark vest, his usually work-roughened hands scrubbed clean. When he saw Sarah, his eyes lit up with an appreciation that sent warmth spreading through her chest. "You both look lovely," he said, stepping forward to help them into the wagon. As his hands steadied her waist, Sarah felt the now familiar flutter that accompanied his touch. Ben scrambled into the back of the wagon beside Lucy, his face flushed with excitement. "I've been telling Will about the Murphy barn for weeks," he chatted as they set off. "It's going to be the biggest in 3 counties when it's finished." The ride to Murphy's farm took them through Willowbrook's outskirts and into the rolling countryside beyond. Will pointed out various landmarks to Sarah as they traveled. The old oak where settlers had reportedly signed the first town charter, the swimming hole where children learned to navigate the current each summer, the hill where the new church would be constructed. "That meadow over there," he indicated with a nod, "is where we hold the summer festival. Music, dancing, games for the children. You'll see it come June." "You speak as if you're certain we'll still be here then," Sarah observed, though the thought of remaining in Willowbrook no longer filled her with anxiety. Will glanced at her, his expression earnest. "I hope you will be. The town's better with you and Lucy in it." He paused, then added more softly, "I'm better with you in it." Before Sarah could respond, they crested a hill and Murphy's farm spread out before them. The scene was already bustling with activity. Men were measuring and cutting lumber in organized groups, while women arranged food stations and children darted between adults, carrying tools and messages. The entire community had transformed into a well-oiled machine, each person understanding their role in the day's ambitious project. Sarah found herself immediately swept into the women's work circle. Mrs. Foster introduced her to several ladies she hadn't yet met, including Mrs. Murphy herself, a cheerful woman with flour-dusted hands and a warm smile that made Sarah feel instantly welcome. "We're so grateful you could join us," Mrs. Murphy said, pressing a cup of fresh cider into Sarah's hands. "Any friend of Will Carter's is a friend of ours." As Sarah helped arrange food at the long table set up in the shade, she listened to the flow of conversation around her. Talk ranged from the upcoming winter preparations to speculation about the new railroad spur that might reach Willowbrook by spring. Several women asked about her work at the bakery, and Mrs. Henderson launched into an elaborate story about her chickens escaping into the church during last Sunday's service, causing such disruption that Reverend Miller had to pause his sermon, until old Pete Johnson could coax them back outside with a trail of grain. From her station near the food tables, Sarah had a clear view of the construction site. Will had shed his jacket and vest, working in his white shirt with sleeves rolled, up to reveal the muscled forearms developed from years at the forge. He moved with confident precision, directing the raising of support beams with a natural authority that drew other men to seek his advice. Even from a distance, she could see the respect his neighbors had for his craftsmanship and leadership. Sheriff Mason called for volunteer groups to tackle different sections of the frame, and Will immediately organized a team that included Dr. Cooper, Bob Turner from the Mercantile, and several younger men eager to prove their worth. Ben worked alongside his brother, his movement still learning but earnest in their effort. As the morning progressed, the barn began to take shape with remarkable speed. The community's cooperation was a marvel to watch, each person contributing their skills to create something that would benefit a neighbor. Sarah found herself thinking of her father, who had always believed in the power of neighbors helping neighbors. This barn raising embodied everything he had valued about rural communities. During a brief water break, Will approached the food stations, his shirt dampened with honest sweat. "How are you managing?" he asked, accepting the water she offered. "Wonderfully. Everyone's been so welcoming." Sarah hesitated, then added, "I've never seen anything like this before, the way everyone works together." "It's what we do here," Will replied simply, but there was pride in his voice. "When someone needs help, we show up. Simple as that." "Where I come from," Sarah said, thinking of their isolated farm in Missouri. "Families mostly managed on their own. This is special." Will's gaze softened. "That's one of the things I hope you'll come to love about Willowbrook, the way we take care of each other." He paused, seeming to weigh his next words. "The way I hope to take care of you." Before Sarah could process this declaration, Ben appeared at Will's elbow. "Brother, they need you at the north corner. Something about the joint not fitting properly." Will squeezed Sarah's hand briefly. "We'll continue this conversation later," he promised, then returned to the construction site. The midday feast was a celebration in itself. Tables groaned under the weight of dishes each family had contributed. Roasted chickens, fresh bread, vegetable stews, pies of every description, and more preserves than Sarah had imagined possible. The community gathered in informal groups, but gradually more formal seating arrangements emerged. Sarah found herself seated at one of the main tables between Will and Lucy, directly across from Sheriff Mason and his wife, a gentlewoman named Ellen. Dr. Cooper sat nearby with Mrs. Foster, and the conversation flowed as easily as the fresh cider being passed around. Sheriff Mason raised his glass in a toast to Robert Murphy and his family, and to all who've put their backs into today's work. May this barn stand strong for generations to come, a testament to what we can accomplish when we work together. "Hear, hear," echoed around the tables, and Sarah lifted her own glass, feeling a deep sense of belonging she hadn't experienced in years. During the meal, she found herself drawn into multiple conversations. Mrs. Foster asked her opinion on organizing the school's winter clothing drive, mentioning that many families struggled to keep their children warm during the harshest months. Dr. Cooper discussed his plans for a temporary infirmary room in the new church, wondering if she might help organize medical supplies since her work with him had shown such promise. Even people she'd only met briefly sought her input. Tommy Baker's mother wanted advice on dealing with her son's persistent sweet tooth. And old Pete Johnson asked if she'd ever worked with leather besides sewing, as he could use help repairing some of the older saddles in town. But it was Thomas Mitchell's absence that spoke loudest of all. Sarah realized she hadn't thought about him all day until Sheriff Mason made an offhand comment about certain troublemakers learning to keep their distance from decent folk. The community had clearly made its position known, and Mitchell had retreated rather than face further censure. As the afternoon wore on and the barn's frame took more definitive shape, the atmosphere shifted from industrious work to festive celebration. Someone produced a fiddle, then another appeared with a guitar, and soon music filled the air. The newly laid barn floor became an impromptu dance floor as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. Couples claimed the space for dancing while others gathered around the edges with cups of cider and slices of pie. Children ran between dancers, playing games and laughing with the pure joy of community celebration. Sarah watched it all with wonder, realizing this was what she'd truly been seeking. Not just a marriage arrangement, but a place to belong. Will appeared at her side as the first waltz began, his presence both expected and somehow surprising. He'd put his vest back on but left it unbuttoned, his shirt still slightly damp from the day's exertion. "Would you do me the honor of this dance?" She placed her hand in his, feeling the calloused warmth that spoke of honest work and gentle care. As they moved onto the makeshift dance floor, Sarah became acutely aware of how perfectly they fit together. his height matching hers, their steps finding synchronization as naturally as breathing. "Thank you for today," she said softly as they swayed to the fiddle's melody. "For what? For including us. For making us feel part of something real." Will's eyes grew serious, searching her face. "Sarah, you're not just part of something. You're becoming the center of something, at least for me." Her breath caught at the intensity of his gaze. Before she could respond, the dance ended and Ben appeared, shifting from foot to foot with nervous energy. "Miss Lucy," he asked, his voice cracking slightly, "would you honor me with the next dance?" Lucy's face lit up with genuine delight. "I'd love to, Ben." Dun. As the younger couple moved away, leaving Will and Sarah standing in the gentle chaos of the celebration, the air between them seemed charged with unspoken possibilities. "I meant what I said," Will continued, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "These past weeks, watching you build a place here, seeing your strength and grace in the face of adversity." He paused, running a hand through his hair in a gesture that was becoming endearingly familiar. "I know this isn't what you planned when you came to Willowbrook. I know you answered Mitchell's letter with certain expectations, and I can't offer you a grand ranch or instant prosperity." Sarah studied his face, honest, open, concerned. "What can you offer?" "A partnership," he said simply. "Someone who values your intelligence and capabilities, someone who sees your worth, not in spite of your circumstances, but because of how you've handled them. Someone who wants to build something, lasting, not just acquire something convenient." Her heart thundered in her chest as she processed his words. Around them the celebration continued, but suddenly the rest of the world seemed distant, unimportant compared to this moment. "Will," she began, then had to clear her throat. "When I came here, I thought I was seeking security, a roof over our heads, a future planned out according to someone else's vision, but I was wrong about what I needed." His expression grew hopeful, uncertain. "What do you need?" "I need someone who sees me, really sees me. Someone who notices when my hands need healing salve after a day of work. Someone who brings thoughtful gifts and defends my character to strangers. Someone who includes me in decisions rather than making them for me." She took a breath, gathering courage. "I need someone like you." The joy that transformed Will's face was like sunrise breaking over the prairie. Without another word, he took her hand again, leading her back onto the dance floor where another waltz had begun. This time, their movements held a different quality, a promise, an understanding that went beyond words. As they danced, Sarah caught glimpses of their community around them. Mrs. Walsh had arrived late, having closed the boarding house kitchen, and was now chatting animatedly with Mrs. Murphy. Dr. Cooper was teaching a group of children a simple reel. Sheriff Mason kept watchful but benevolent eye over the festivities, and there, at the edge of the dancing area, she noticed a familiar figure lurking in the shadows. Thomas Mitchell had apparently decided to make an appearance after all, nursing what looked like a flask and glowering at the celebration. For a moment, Sarah tensed, wondering if he'd cause another scene. But then Will spun her in a turn that made her laugh, and when she looked back she saw that several men, including Sheriff Mason and Bob Turner, had positioned themselves between Mitchell and the dancers. The message was clear. He could observe from the periphery, but any disruption would be swiftly handled. "What are you smiling about?" Will asked, noting her expression. "I'm thinking about how wrong Mitchell was," she replied. "He called me too skinny, unsuitable, a charity case. But look around, Will. I'm not a charity case. I'm a contributing member of this community. I work, I help others, I'm building a life here." Will's arms tightened around her slightly. "You're far more than that. You're brave and adaptable. You've turned rejection into opportunity, uncertainty into purpose. Mitchell was a fool to let you go, but I'm grateful he did." As the music swelled, Will drew her closer. "Sarah, I know it's too soon for certain promises. We've only known each other a short time, and there's much we still need to learn about each other. But I'd like the chance to find out everything, your favorite time of day, what makes you laugh, what you dream about when you can't sleep. And I'd like to learn those things about you," she responded. "I want to know why you became a blacksmith, what your hopes are for the future, how you take your coffee in the morning." They shared a smile at this last detail, remembering the morning he'd noticed her chapped hands and provided salve. Such small attentions had meant more than grand gestures ever could. The dance ended, and as couples dispersed and reformed for the next song, Will kept her hand in his. "Will you walk with me? There's something I'd like to show you before it gets too dark." She nodded, and they made their way to the edge of the festivities where the rising moon was beginning to paint everything in silver. Will led her toward the completed barn, its new wood still smelling of fresh lumber and possibility. "From here," he said, gesturing toward the barn's foundation, "you can see all of Willowbrook. See?" He pointed across the darkening landscape. "There's the church steeple just visible above those trees and the glow from the forge. I always bank the fires carefully, but they still give off light for hours. That cluster of buildings is Main Street." Sarah looked where he indicated, seeing her new home from a different perspective. "It looks peaceful from here. Permanent. It is permanent in the ways that matter. Communities like this endure because people invest in them, care for them." He turned to face her directly. "I'm investing in Willowbrook's future, and I'm hoping you'll be part of that future." The implications of his words hung in the air between them. Sarah looked up at his earnest face, seeing not just the kind blacksmith who'd shown her consideration, but a man who understood what partnership meant. Someone who'd spent the day building a barn for a neighbor and would do the same for anyone who needed help. "Will," she said softly, "when I first arrived, I thought I was looking for security, but I realize now that security isn't just about having a roof over your head or enough food on the table. It's about knowing that someone has your back, that you're working towards something meaningful together." She took a breath, her heart pounding but her resolve clear. "I'd like to be part of Willowbrook's future. I'd like to continue getting to know you, seeing where this path leads us." The relief and joy on Will's face was answer enough, but he spoke anyway. "I promise you won't regret it. We'll take things slow, proper-like, court the way decent people should, but Sarah..." He caught both her hands in his. "I already know you're more than I hoped to find. You're everything Mitchell was too blind to see." In the distance, the celebration continued with renewed energy. Someone had started a reel, and the sound of stomping feet and clapping hands carried across the farmyard. But here, in the quiet space between the new barn and the old oak tree, Sarah felt like she and Will existed in their own perfect moment. "We should go back," she said reluctantly. "Lucy will wonder where I've gone." "In a moment," Will agreed, but made no move to release her hands. "I just want to remember this. The way you look in the moonlight, the sound of community celebration in the background, the moment when everything changed." Sarah smiled, feeling tears prick at her eyes, not of sadness, but of overwhelming gratitude. "Everything did change, didn't it? I came here expecting one thing and found something entirely different, something better." "The best things often come when we're not looking for them," Will murmured, then seemed to make a decision. He released one of her hands but kept the other firmly in his grip. "Come on, let's go dance some more. I want everyone to see that Sarah Jenkins has chosen to stay in Willowbrook and that Will Carter is the luckiest man in Texas." They walked back toward the celebration, hands linked and hearts full. As they approached the dancers, Sarah caught sight of Lucy and Ben, flushed and laughing as they attempted to follow the complicated steps of the reel. Mrs. Walsh caught her eye and gave her an approving nod. Even Thomas Mitchell had apparently decided that discretion was the better part of valor, as his lurking presence had disappeared entirely. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of music, laughter, and dancing. Sarah found herself passed from partner to partner in the group dances, welcomed into the community with a warmth that would have been unimaginable just days ago. But always, she found her way back to Will, their connection growing stronger with each shared smile, each touch of hands, each moment of understanding. As the moon rose higher and the celebration began to wind down, families started gathering their belongings and saying their goodbyes. Children slept in parents' arms, while teenagers lingered, reluctant to end the magical evening. Will helped Sarah and Lucy into the wagon, Ben scrambling up beside his brother. The ride back to town was quieter than the journey out, but filled with comfortable silence and the occasional burst of conversation as Lucy recounted the day's highlights to anyone who would listen. "Ben taught me the Texas two-step," she announced proudly, "and Mrs. Murphy says I have natural rhythm." "You did beautifully," Sarah assured her, smiling at her sister's enthusiasm. As they reached the edge of town, Will slowed the wagon slightly. "Sarah," he said, his voice carrying a hint of nervousness, "may I call on you tomorrow? Perhaps take you for a walk after church services?" The formality of the request after the day's intimacy made her smile. "I'd like that very much." When they reached Mrs. Walsh's boarding house, Will helped them down from the wagon with the same careful attention he'd shown that morning. But now there was an added tenderness, a promise of things to come. "Thank you for today," Sarah said, echoing her words from earlier, but meaning them differently now. "For everything." Will stepped closer, close enough that she could see the moonlight, reflected in his eyes. "Thank you for giving us a chance, for choosing to stay, for being exactly who you are." For a heartbeat, Sarah thought he might kiss her, and her breath caught in anticipation. But instead, he lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her palm before closing her fingers over it. "Until tomorrow," he said softly. She watched him drive away with Ben, the wagon's wheels crunching on the gravel road. Lucy had already gone inside, leaving Sarah alone with the night and the warmth spreading through her chest. Mrs. Walsh was waiting in the parlor when Sarah entered, knitting in her lap and a knowing smile on her face. "Well?" the older woman asked without looking up from her work. "Well, what?" Sarah replied, unable to suppress her own smile. "Don't play coy with me, young lady. I've been running this boarding house for 20 years. I know the look of a woman who's found something worth keeping." Sarah sank into the chair. Across from her, suddenly exhausted but also exhilarated. "He's a good man, Mrs. Walsh, better than I expected to find." "And you're a smart woman, Sarah Jenkins. Smart enough to see worth when others see only surface appearances." Mrs. Walsh set down her knitting. Mitchell thought he was getting a convenience, a solution to his domestic needs. Will's smart enough to see a partner, an equal. "Is that what you think, that we could be equals? I think you already are. The question isn't whether you can be equals, it's whether you're brave enough to build something together." That night, as Sarah helped Lucy prepare for bed, her sister couldn't stop talking about the day's events. "Ben says there's a harvest. Dance in 3 weeks," Lucy chattered as Sarah brushed out her hair, "and a Christmas social at the church, and a Valentine's box supper." Sarah listened with amusement, recognizing her own growing excitement about future events in Lucy's enthusiasm. They had a calendar of celebrations to look forward to, a community to be part of, plans extending beyond mere survival. When Lucy finally drifted off to sleep, Sarah sat by the window as had become her habit, but tonight her contemplation held a different quality. She wasn't looking out at an unknown future anymore. She was gazing at a town she was beginning to call home. Opening the leather journal Will had given her, she began writing about the day. But instead of recording facts and events, she found herself writing about feelings, hopes, possibilities. The words flowed easily, filling page after page with observations about community, belonging, and the unexpected ways love could develop. As she wrote, she thought about the circular nature of her journey. She'd come to Willowbrook seeking security through marriage to Thomas Mitchell. Instead, she'd found security through community, work, and genuine connection. Mitchell had rejected her for being too skinny, too unsuitable for his grand plans. But Willowbrook and Will had welcomed her exactly as she was. The irony wasn't lost on her. Mitchell had wanted someone who looked the part of a rancher's wife. Will wanted someone who could be a partner in building a life, regardless of appearance or social status. One had measured her by arbitrary standards. The other valued her for her character, intelligence, and resilience. She closed the journal and prepared for bed, her last conscious thought being of Will's promise to call tomorrow. As sleep claimed her, Sarah smiled, thinking of afternoon walks and evening conversations, of barn raisings and harvest dances, of all the ordinary moments that would build into something extraordinary. Outside, Willowbrook settled into its nightly rhythm. Somewhere, Will was probably thinking about tomorrow's sermon and whether he'd have the courage to hold her hand. During their walk, Dr. Cooper was finishing his notes about the day's minor injuries and overindulgences. Sheriff Mason was making his final rounds, ensuring all was secure. Mrs. Murphy was probably looking out at her new barn with satisfaction, already planning the crops it would shelter. And in the boarding house on Cedar Street, two women who had arrived as strangers were now sleeping peacefully in a town they could call home. Sarah Jenkins had come to Willowbrook seeking one kind of future and found something infinitely better, a place where she belonged, work that satisfied her, and the beginning of love based not on convenience or appearance, but on mutual respect and growing affection. The morning would bring new possibilities, new challenges, new moments of grace. But tonight, with the memory of Will's kiss on her palm still warm, Sarah allowed herself to dream of a future that stretched beyond tomorrow's. Walk beyond next week's harvest dance, beyond the coming winter into springs and summers yet to come. Mitchell had been wrong about more than just her suitability as a wife. He'd been wrong about what constituted true worth, real partnership, and lasting love. Sarah drifted off to sleep with a smile on her face, grateful for a rejection that had led her exactly where she was meant to be. In the days, weeks, and months to come, she would continue to build her life in Willowbrook. She would perfect her bread-baking skills, organize community events, become an indispensable part of Dr. Cooper's practice. Lucy would flourish, growing from girl to young woman under the care of a supportive community. And Will would continue to court her with patience and devotion, proving daily that he saw in her not a convenience, but a treasure. Years later, when people asked Sarah about her journey to Willowbrook, she would smile and say that sometimes the best destinations are the ones you never intended to reach. Thomas Mitchell had thought he was rejecting a mail-order bride who was too skinny to be useful. Instead, he had unknowingly sent her straight into the arms of the man who would appreciate everything he had failed to see. But that was all in the future. Tonight, Sarah simply slept peacefully in the knowledge that tomorrow would bring Will Carter to her door, ready to begin building a story far better than any that had been written before. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.